My wife cheated with a colleague and was shocked when she saw me with a beautiful woman. She had no idea what we were going to do. And then the day began like any other family gathering, but something felt off. It was Lauren's birthday, a small garden celebration in our backyard. She had just turned 6, and we had balloons, a cake with those vibrant candles she loved. Our son, Jake, who had just turned 8, was running around wildly, clearly on a sugar rush. The sun was shining, and everything should have been perfect, but it wasn't. My wife, Ashley, seemed distant. You know that feeling when something's wrong, but you can't quite place what it is? That was me. All day, I had this unsettling feeling, like I was standing at the edge of something terrible, but I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if something truly was wrong. Ashley was talking to Tim, a colleague from her advertising job. She had always had male friends, and I had never been the jealous type. But that day, something about the way they interacted got under my skin. Tim wasn't just making small talk with her. They were sharing glances, the kind that say far more than words ever could. It was subtle, but I noticed it. I always noticed these things. I tried convincing myself that I was overreacting. Maybe they were just laughing at some inside joke from work. Maybe they were just friends. But the way Ashley's posture changed when Tim came near made my stomach twist. I kept watching them throughout the day, unable to shake the feeling. Ashley was smiling, but it wasn't the same smile she had for me. It was different, too personal, too intimate. And Tim, well, he was leaning in just a bit too much, his eyes lingering on her lips when she spoke. After the guests left, and our kids were finally in bed, I sat down with a beer, trying to dismiss the thoughts in my head. But I couldn't. It kept gnawing at me, so I grabbed Ashley's phone, something I had never done before. I used to trust her completely, or at least I thought I did. Then I saw it, a text from Tim. "Last night was fun. We should do it again soon." My heart stopped. You know that moment when your chest tightens, and you hope you've misread something? That was me. I stared at that message for a minute, maybe more, before the anger began to rise. I marched into the kitchen where she was, holding her phone up. "Who the hell is Tim?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but failing. Ashley's face went pale for just a second before she put on her usual mask of calm. "You're going through my phone now?" she said, trying to make me feel like the villain, like I was the one out of line. Gaslighting. She always did that during arguments. "It's nothing," she added. "You're being paranoid. Tim and I are just friends. I can't believe you're doing this, especially today, on Lauren's birthday." But I wasn't buying it. Just friends don't send texts like that. What does "last night was fun" mean, Ashley? We stood there in silence, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. She looked at me like I was the one who'd crossed a line, like I was the one at fault. My mind raced, remembering every late-night meeting she'd had, every unexplained dinner, every time she brushed me off when I asked about her day. "You're imagining things, Josh," she said sharply. "Stop being so insecure." But her eyes betrayed her. They always did. There was a flicker of guilt, or maybe fear. Either way, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I needed to talk to someone about it, someone who could help me sort through the mess in my head. That's when I called Aaron. Aaron and I had been friends for as long as I could remember, long before Ashley was even in the picture. She knew me better than anyone else, and somehow, I felt like she'd understand. I didn't tell her much over the phone, just that I needed to talk. She was at my house in less than an hour. It felt weird spilling everything to her, but she listened without flinching, like she always had. And when I told her about the text from Tim, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she gave me a knowing look, one that told me she knew something I didn't. "Josh," she said, leaning forward, "if something feels off, it probably is. Trust your instincts." Her words hit me hard. I wasn't crazy. Ashley was hiding something, and I wasn't going to let her convince me otherwise. Aaron offered to help me figure it out. She suggested we keep an eye on Ashley, see what she was doing when she wasn't at home. It felt wrong, sneaky, but at that point, I needed answers. I couldn't keep living with this uncertainty. So, we waited. Aaron, ever the practical one, made sure we were discreet. We didn't want Ashley catching on. She was already calling me paranoid. The last thing I needed was to give her more ammunition. One evening, We parked across the street from her office, watching from a distance. It felt ridiculous, like some amateur spy movie, but this was my life now. Tailing my own wife, trying to catch her in a lie. After what felt like hours, I finally saw her. She wasn't alone. Tim was with her. They walked out together, side by side, laughing. I felt sick. "Follow them," Aaron whispered, and we did. They went to a small, intimate restaurant, the kind of place couples go to. I watched them from the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Tim pulled out a chair for her, and Ashley smiled at him. The smile that used to be mine. The one she used to give me when we first fell in love. I couldn't take it anymore. "This is it," I muttered, my voice trembling with rage. Erin didn't say much, but I could tell she understood. She had been through something similar. I knew that. She knew the pain of betrayal. We watched them for a while longer, but I couldn't stand it. I needed to confront her. I needed the truth. When I got home, Ashley was already there, lounging on the couch like she hadn't just spent the evening with another man. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, trying not to let my voice shake. She looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing. "Out with friends," she replied coolly. "Why? What's with the interrogation?" I wasn't going to let her twist things around this time. "I followed you, Ashley. I saw you with Tim." Her face changed instantly, a flicker of panic before she quickly regained her composure. "You followed me?" she asked, incredulous. "Jesus, Josh, do you even hear yourself? That's insane." I didn't back down. "I saw you at that restaurant. You can't lie to me anymore." There was a long pause. Her defenses crumbled. "Fine," she said quietly. "Yes, I've been spending time with Tim, but it's not what you think. I've been lonely, Josh. You've been so caught up in work and the kids that I've felt invisible. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Emotional affair. That's what she called it. Like it was somehow less damaging because they hadn't crossed a physical line. But to me, it didn't matter. She had crossed a boundary, and there was no coming back from that. The argument dragged on, accusations flying from both sides. It was toxic, brutal. By the end, I was exhausted, hollow. I slept on the couch that night, my mind spinning. After that night, everything in my life shifted. The confrontation with Ashley had left me numb, and for the first time, I felt a real sense of distance between us. Even though we still shared the same house, the energy between us had changed. We were living like strangers, going through the motions of being a family for the sake of our kids, but there was a thick wall of silence that neither of us was willing to break. Our interactions became mechanical, coordinating who would take Jake to soccer practice or making sure Lauren had what she needed for school. But there was no warmth, no affection. I found myself thinking constantly about that moment in the kitchen, when everything had come crashing down. It replayed in my head over and over again. The moment when I realized that the woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children, had chosen to betray me. She said it hadn't gone too far, that it was just emotional, but that did nothing to lessen the pain. Every time I thought about her with Tim, laughing at their secret jokes or texting late at night, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. It didn't matter if they hadn't slept together. In my mind, the betrayal had already happened the moment she let him in. For a while, I tried to throw myself into my routine, hoping that staying busy would numb the pain. I'd focus on work, spend more time with the kids, and try to act like everything was normal. But it wasn't. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the things I couldn't say out loud. I didn't know what to do with all the anger, the sadness, and the confusion that had taken root inside me. Ashley had shattered my trust, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her for it. But what scared me the most was the uncertainty about what came next. During the day, I did everything I could to hold it together for Jake and Lauren. I didn't want them to feel the weight of what was happening between their mother and me. I made an extra effort to be present, taking them to the park, helping them with their homework, and even making their favorite dinners, though I wasn't much of a cook. I thought that if I could give them a sense of stability, maybe it would ease the tension in the house, but it was impossible to keep the cracks from showing. One night, after another quiet and tense dinner, I found Jake standing at the top of the stairs, watching Ashley and me with a look of confusion on his face. He didn't say anything, but I could see the question in his eyes. He wanted to know why things felt so different. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything was going to be okay, but the truth was, I wasn't sure if it ever would be. Lauren, too young to fully understand, clung to her stuffed animal as if it could protect her from the changes happening in our family. The sight of my kids trying to navigate through the storm of my marriage was like a punch to the gut. It wasn't long before I started leaning more and more on Erin. She had become my confidant, the one person I could talk to without feeling like I had to hold back. There was something about her presence that brought me a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. We would meet up for coffee or take walks, and I'd tell her everything, my doubts, my fears, and the anger that I still didn't know how to let go of. She was always there, listening without judgment, offering support when I felt like I was drowning. But as much as I relied on Erin, there was something else building between us, something I hadn't expected. The more time we spent together, the more I began to realize that my feelings for her weren't just about friendship anymore. There was a tension between us that neither of us spoke about, but it was impossible to ignore. When I was around her, the weight of everything with Ashley seemed to fade, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I knew I was walking a dangerous line. I told myself that Erin and I were just friends, that what I was feeling was just the result of the chaos that had taken over my life. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was drawn to her in a way I hadn't been drawn to anyone in a long time. It wasn't just about the comfort she provided. It was about the way she looked at me, the way she understood what I was going through without me having to explain it. With Erin, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel like a failure. I tried to push those feelings aside, telling myself that it was wrong, that I shouldn't be thinking about Erin when my marriage was falling apart. But it wasn't that simple. The more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. Eventually, it reached a point where I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something between us, and it wasn't just a friendship. It was something more, something that had grown out of the wreckage of my relationship with Ashley. One evening, after a particularly rough day, Erin and I met up at a small cafe. We sat outside, talking about everything but the elephant in the room. But the tension was palpable, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. As we sat there, sipping our drinks, I found myself looking at her in a way I hadn't before. I was no longer just leaning on her for emotional support. I was falling for her. It scared me, but it also felt inevitable. That night, after we said goodbye, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I lay in bed, the silence of the house pressing down on me, and all I could think about was Erin. How different things felt when I was around her, how much lighter everything seemed. I knew it was wrong. I knew that jumping into something with Erin so soon after everything with Ashley was dangerous, but it was like I was powerless to stop it. I had spent so long feeling lost and broken, and Erin made me feel whole again. She made me feel seen. But I also knew that what was happening with Erin wasn't a solution to the mess I was in. It was a distraction, a way to escape the reality of my crumbling marriage. I couldn't pretend that starting something with Erin would fix everything, and I couldn't ignore the fact that my kids were still caught in the middle of it all. They didn't deserve to have their lives turned upside down because I couldn't figure out how to deal with my emotions. I started to realize that I needed to take a step back. I needed to focus on my kids, on figuring out what came next for me, instead of getting caught up in something new with Erin. As much as I cared about her, I wasn't ready. My life was too messy, too complicated, and I couldn't drag her into it. She deserved more than that. She deserved someone who wasn't broken, someone who could give her the attention and care she deserved. And I wasn't that person. Not yet. In the days that followed, I tried to put some distance between us. Erin understood, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. It wasn't that I didn't want to be with her. I did, but I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready to jump into something new while I was still dealing with the wreckage of my marriage. I needed time to heal, to figure out who I was outside of all this chaos. Ashley, meanwhile, continued to act like nothing had changed. She went about her days as if we weren't teetering on the edge of something unfixable. We were living under the same roof, but we were worlds apart. We barely spoke, except for the necessary conversations about the kids or the logistics of running the household. There were moments when I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could act so indifferent, how she could have done what she did and still look me in the eye like nothing had happened. But I didn't. I kept it inside, knowing that yelling wouldn't change anything. One evening, after another long day, I sat down with Lauren to help her with her school project. She was working on a poster about her favorite animal, dolphins, and I watched as she carefully colored in the shapes. As I sat there, I realized that this was what mattered. My kids were what mattered. Not the betrayal, not the anger, not even the unresolved feelings I had for Aaron. What mattered was being there for Lauren and Jake, making sure that they knew they could count on me no matter what. I had spent so much time focusing on what Ashley had done, on how she had hurt me, that I had lost sight of what really mattered. My family, my relationship with my kids, that's what I needed to prioritize. Ashley had made her choices, and I couldn't control that. But I could control how I showed up for my kids. I could be there for them, even if things with Ashley were falling apart. As the days passed, I began to let go of the anger. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the pain would hit me out of nowhere, like a wave crashing over me. But I started to realize that holding on to that pain wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't going to change what Ashley had done, and it wasn't going to make me feel any better. If anything, it was just weighing me down, keeping me stuck in a place I didn't want to be. One night, after I had put the kids to bed, I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where Ashley and I used to sit together. It felt like a lifetime ago. I thought about everything we had been through, all the good times, the bad times, and how we had ended up here. Two people who had once loved each other but were now barely holding on. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I knew deep down that our marriage was over. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. In that quiet moment, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, pretending that everything was fine for the sake of appearances. It wasn't fine, and it hadn't been for a long time. It was time to face the truth, time to take the next step, whatever that looked like. It was time to let go. The decision to finally let go of my marriage felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but it was also terrifying. Once I acknowledged that it was over, there was no more pretending, no more clinging to the hope that maybe, somehow, we could fix things. It was the beginning of a new chapter, but one I had no idea how to navigate. I had no roadmap for what came next. All I knew was that I needed to move forward, for myself and for my kids. The day I told Ashley that it was time to separate was one of the hardest days of my life. It wasn't filled with the shouting or accusations that had characterized so many of our recent interactions. Instead, it was quiet, almost surreal. We sat in the living room, the space between us feeling like an endless void. I told her that I couldn't do it anymore, that I couldn't keep pretending we had something to salvage when we both knew it was broken beyond repair. She didn't fight me. Maybe she had been expecting it, or maybe she had come to the same realization herself. Either way, the conversation ended with a hollow agreement that we would figure out the logistics of separating our lives. In the days that followed, we began the painful process of untangling everything we had built together, dividing up the house, sorting through years of shared memories, and figuring out how we would co-parent Jake and Lauren. We didn't argue about the details, but every decision felt like a small death, a piece of our life together falling away. We sold the house, the place where our kids had grown up, and that was when it really hit me. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an era. The life I had known, the family I had tried to hold together, was dissolving in front of me. Moving out of that house was harder than I had expected. It wasn't just a physical move. It was the emotional weight of leaving behind the place where so much of our lives had unfolded. I had spent countless nights lying awake, thinking about what could have been, but now, standing in the empty house, I realized there was no point in holding on to those thoughts anymore. The memories were bittersweet, a mix of the joy we had once shared and the pain that had come in the end. As I locked the door for the last time, I felt a strange sense of closure. This was the final step in letting go. After the move, I found myself in a small apartment not too far from where we used to live, close enough that Jake and Lauren could still feel like they had some stability. The place was modest, but it was mine, and that was what I needed. For the first time in years, I was living on my own, with no one to answer to but myself. There were moments when the silence was deafening, when I would catch myself reaching for my phone to text Ashley about something before remembering that part of my life was over. But there were also moments of peace, moments when I could finally breathe without the constant tension that had filled our house. The kids adjusted better than I had expected, though it wasn't easy for them. Jake, being older, seemed to understand more of what was happening, though he never asked too many questions. I think he sensed that I was still figuring things out myself. Lauren, on the other hand, struggled more. She would ask when we were all going to live together again, or why Mom and Dad didn't love each other anymore. It broke my heart every time, but I knew that honesty was the only way forward. I told her that sometimes, even when people love each other, they can't always stay together, but that it didn't mean we loved her or Jake any less. I wasn't sure if she fully understood, but I hoped that, in time, she would. Co-parenting with Ashley was a new challenge. We had to learn how to communicate in a way that didn't reignite old wounds, and for the most part, we managed. We kept things civil for the sake of the kids, trading off weekends and making sure we were both there for important events like school plays or soccer games. But there was an underlying tension that never really went away. Even though we weren't fighting anymore, the wounds of our failed marriage were still fresh, and every interaction was a reminder of the life we had lost. I avoided spending too much time around her, keeping our conversations strictly about the kids or logistical matters. It was easier that way. Aaron remained a constant presence in my life, though things between us had changed. After everything, we had taken a step back, recognizing that neither of us was in the right place for something serious. I cared about her deeply, but I wasn't ready to jump into a new relationship when I was still trying to figure out who I was on my own. We still talked, still met up for coffee now and then, but the dynamic was different. There was a quiet understanding between us, an acknowledgement that whatever had been building between us would have to wait. As the months passed, I focused on rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I poured myself into my work, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the routine. I spent as much time as I could with Jake and Lauren, making sure they knew that I was still there for them, even if things were different now. We developed new traditions, movie nights at my apartment, trips to the park, weekend adventures that were just the three of us. It wasn't the same as it had been when we were all together as a family, but it was something. Slowly, I began to find my footing. But even as I moved forward, there were still moments when the weight of it all hit me. There were days when I would look at my kids and feel an overwhelming sense of guilt. I had tried so hard to protect them from the fallout of my marriage, but I knew that they had felt the impact, whether I wanted to admit it or not. Every time I saw the sadness in their eyes, or heard them ask why things had to change, it felt like a reminder that I had failed them. I did my best to reassure them, to make them feel loved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let them down. I also found myself thinking about Ashley more than I wanted to. Not in the way I had when we were together, but in a way that felt more reflective, more distant. I would think about the early years of our relationship when everything had seemed so simple, so full of promise. How had we ended up here, so far from the life we had planned? There were days when I found myself missing the familiarity of her presence, the way we used to know each other so well. But then I would remember how it had all fallen apart, the betrayal, the lies, and the distance that had grown between us long before Tim had entered the picture. Those memories were enough to remind me that going back wasn't an option. In those moments, I had to remind myself that moving forward wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about learning from it. I had spent so much time focused on what had gone wrong with Ashley, on the pain and the betrayal, that I hadn't taken the time to look inward, to figure out what I needed to change about myself. I couldn't control what had happened, but I could control how I responded to it. I could take responsibility for my part in the breakdown of our marriage and make sure that I didn't repeat those mistakes moving forward. Therapy helped. I had resisted it for a long time, telling myself that I didn't need it, that I could figure things out on my own. But after everything, I knew that I needed help making sense of the emotions that had been building inside me. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the situation allowed me to see things from a different perspective. I realized that I had spent so much energy trying to fix things, to keep the family together, that I had lost sight of what I needed for myself. I had neglected my own happiness for years, thinking that if I just kept pushing forward, everything would eventually work out. But that's not how life works. As I worked through my feelings, I began to understand that part of the reason my marriage had failed was because I had been afraid to confront the truth. I had seen the signs long before Ashley's affair with Tim, but I had ignored them, hoping that things would get better on their own. I had let my fear of failure and my desire to keep my family intact blind me to the reality that we had grown apart. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating. It allowed me to let go of the guilt I had been carrying, to forgive myself for not being able to save something that was already broken. The kids were my constant motivation. Every time I felt like I was slipping, like the weight of everything was too much, I would think about them. They were my anchor, the reason I kept pushing forward. Watching them grow, seeing their resilience in the face of all the changes, reminded me of what was most important. I wasn't just rebuilding my life for myself, I was doing it for them, too. I wanted to be the kind of father they could look up to, the kind of father they could rely on. And that meant letting go of the past, no matter how hard it was. Life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. I had come to terms with the end of my marriage, found my footing as a single parent, and was learning to live for myself again. The apartment felt more like home, and the kids were adapting to the new normal. Weekends with Jake and Lauren were filled with laughter, movie nights, and trips to the park. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things were moving in the right direction. But just as I began to feel a sense of peace, something happened that shook me to my core. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and I was getting dinner ready for the kids when I got a phone call from Ashley's sister, Katie. I hadn't spoken to her much since the separation, but the sound of her voice instantly made me tense. There was a strange edge to it, something I couldn't quite place, and it set off alarm bells in my head. She asked if I had heard from Ashley that day, and when I told her I hadn't, there was a long pause. My stomach twisted as she explained that Ashley had missed work and wasn't answering her phone. Katie said she had been trying to get in touch with her all day but hadn't had any luck. A wave of dread washed over me. I immediately thought of the kids. They were with me, safe and sound. But the idea that something might be wrong with Ashley sent my mind into a spiral. Despite everything that had happened between us, she was still the mother of my children, and the thought of something bad happening to her was almost unbearable. I told Katie I'd go check on her, though I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me thought it was probably nothing. Maybe Ashley had just turned her phone off for some space. But there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me this was different. After making sure the kids were settled, I headed over to the house where Ashley had been living since the separation. It was strange walking up to that front door again, a place that had once been my home. Now it felt foreign, almost eerie. When I knocked, there was no answer. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The uneasy feeling intensified. Something wasn't right. I fished the spare key from under the mat and let myself in. The house was dark, quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. I called her name, hoping she would just appear, annoyed that I had come barging in. But there was nothing. My voice echoed through the empty rooms, met with only silence. As I moved through the house, my heart pounded harder with each step. The kitchen was clean, the living room tidy, nothing seemed out of place. But when I reached the stairs, a sense of dread washed over me. I could feel it in my bones that something was wrong. I climbed the steps slowly, my hand gripping the banister, bracing myself for whatever I might find. The door to her bedroom was ajar, and I pushed it open with trembling hands. What I saw next made my breath catch in my throat. Ashley was lying on the bed, pale and motionless, her eyes closed. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind tried to convince me she was just asleep, that she would wake up and everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it in the air, a heavy, suffocating stillness that told me something was terribly wrong. I rushed to her side, shaking her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. Her skin was cold to the touch, and there was no sign of life. My heart pounded in my chest as panic set in. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. The realization hit me like a freight train. Ashley was gone. I stumbled back, my mind racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The room seemed to spin around me as I tried to make sense of it. How could this be real? How could she be gone? I called 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes that followed felt like a blur. Paramedics arrived, Police asked questions, and I stood there in a daze, unable to focus on anything but the overwhelming shock that had gripped me. They tried to revive her, but it was clear that she had been gone for hours. I had never felt so helpless in my life. Watching them cover her body and wheel her out of the house felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't believe this was happening. Ashley, the woman I had spent years building a life with, the mother of my children, was gone. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. The police investigation revealed that Ashley had died of an overdose, painkillers mixed with alcohol. It was ruled an accidental death, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I knew she had been struggling after the separation, but I never imagined it would come to this. I felt a crushing guilt, wondering if I had missed the signs, if I could have done something to help her before it was too late. The kids took the news hard, especially Jake. He was old enough to understand what had happened, but not old enough to process it. He didn't ask many questions, but I could see the pain in his eyes, the way he withdrew into himself. Lauren was too young to fully grasp the situation, but she sensed the sadness around her, and that was enough to unsettle her. I did my best to comfort them, but there were no words that could make this better. How do you explain to your children that their mother is gone? How do you help them heal when you're barely holding it together yourself? I spent a lot of time thinking about Ashley in those weeks after her death. We had been through so much together: love, betrayal, anger, and now grief. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the lies, I couldn't hate her. I felt sadness, deep and profound, for the life she could have had, for the pain she must have been feeling to turn to substances for relief. The thought that she had been suffering in silence, that she had felt so alone, haunted me. I found myself replaying our last conversation over and over in my head, wondering if there was something I had missed, some hint that she was on the edge. She had seemed distant, but I had assumed it was just the aftermath of the separation. I never imagined it was something more. The guilt gnawed at me. Could I have done something differently? Could I have saved her? But no matter how many times I asked myself those questions, I knew I couldn't change what had happened. Ashley was gone, and all I could do now was pick up the pieces and try to move forward for the sake of our kids. It felt impossible at times, but I didn't have a choice. They needed me now more than ever. The funeral was a somber affair. People who had once been part of our lives came to pay their respects, but the air was thick with sadness and regret. As I stood by her graveside, holding Lauren's hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't how it was supposed to end. We had started our life together with so much hope, so much love, and yet here we were, burying the woman I had once thought I would grow old with. It was a bitter pill to swallow. After the funeral, things didn't get easier. The weight of Ashley's death hung over us like a dark cloud. The kids were grieving in their own ways. Jake became quieter, more withdrawn, while Lauren clung to me, needing constant reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. I tried to be strong for them, but there were nights when, after they had gone to bed, I would sit alone in the quiet of my apartment, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had happened. Grief is a strange thing. It comes in waves, crashing over you when you least expect it, pulling you under before you can catch your breath. Through it all, Erin remained by my side. She offered support in whatever way I needed. Sometimes that meant watching the kids when I needed a moment to myself. Other times it was just being there to listen when the weight of it all became too much. I had told myself that I needed to take a step back from her, to focus on rebuilding my life on my own. But in the aftermath of Ashley's death, I found myself leaning on her more than ever. She became my lifeline, the one person I could rely on when everything else felt like it was falling apart. But as grateful as I was for Erin, there was a part of me that felt conflicted. I couldn't deny the feelings that had developed between us, but I also couldn't shake the guilt. It felt wrong to move forward with her when Ashley's death was still so fresh, so raw. I didn't want to use her as a crutch, and I didn't want to jump into something new just to fill the void that Ashley's absence had left. I needed time to process, to heal, but it was hard when Erin was always there, offering comfort. In the weeks following the funeral, I started to see things more clearly. Losing Ashley had made me realize just how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. It forced me to confront my own emotions, to stop running from the pain and the guilt that had been weighing me down. I realized that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had happened. I had to face it head on and find a way to move forward, not just for the kids, but for myself. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief was overwhelming, when I felt like I was drowning in it. But little by little, I started to find moments of peace. I found solace in the time I spent with Jake and Lauren, in the small, quiet moments that reminded me of what really mattered. We were a different kind of family now, but we were still a family, and that was enough. As I stood at Ashley's grave one last time, I felt a sense of closure, not just for her, but for the chapter of my life that had ended with her death. I would always carry the memories of our time together, both the good and the bad, but I was no longer defined by them. I had a new life to build, a future to look forward to, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready for whatever came next. Life would never be the same, but that didn't mean it couldn't be good again. It was time to move forward.